and welcome to my audio short story channel. It's good to see you here. Today's story is The Dumpster Behind Wong's Walk. It involves a mafia rat, a trafficker, a mean food worker. Is there anybody in this world who's real? That's the question on the mind of one dumpster diver who is simply searching for food to satisfy his hungry stomach. Enjoy the story. I'll see you at the end, and tune in next week when I share insights about today's story. The Dumpster Behind Wong's Walk. A story by Janet Keller Richards, copyright 2023, all rights reserved. My stomach was talking to me loudly and telling me how upset it was. I talked right back to it. Hey, I'm not a lazy guy. It's not like I've been sitting around doing nothing. If you're all that hungry, why don't you find us some food? Of course, all I heard back in reply was another angry gurgle. I really have been searching for something to eat. Yesterday I made the rounds to all my usual restaurant dumpsters, but nothing was edible. Stuff either smelled bad or had too much garbage on top of it to be able to brush it off. And I don't want to get sick again with food poisoning. Let me tell you, that is no fun. I considered checking out new dumpsters behind new restaurants, but then I remembered that huge food worker from Al's Pizzeria who was eager to knock me silly. The guy was as wide as a small car and had a neck thicker than a light pole. When he saw me digging in the pizzeria's dumpster, he started hollering and coming after me on those giant thighs of his, threatening me to within an inch of my life. I'm sure the only reason I'm still pounding the sidewalks is because he decided to save some of his meanness for someone else later in the day. That's how I ended up at one of my usual haunts, the dumpster behind Wong's Walk. The back door of the restaurant is near the dumpster, but I didn't expect any trouble because Wong's doesn't even open until 11 a.m. And thanks to my stomach nagging me as soon as the sun said good morning, I was there plenty early. I peered into the dumpster. Right there on the top layer of trash sat 3 beautiful large slices of pepperoni pizza, my favorite flavor, in an open cardboard box. I didn't even have to dig for them. It's not too often that I scored such a great find, so in one quick motion I hauled myself over the front edge of the dumpster for a closer inspection. The pizza slices didn't seem older than a day or two, and they looked pretty clean. My stomach gurgled happily as I grabbed the first slice. When I reached for the other 2 pieces, I heard the sound of a hissing rat. Let me tell you, some rats come straight out of Hades. It only takes one wild-eyed rat leaping at you with a vengeance, its claws out and its teeth bared, to understand that not all rats are created equal. Most of them don't attack unless they feel threatened, but I promise you there are evil rats. The bad ones are probably hired by the rat mafia to take out anybody who invades their territory. Once a crazed rat in the dumpster behind DeGardi's Italian restaurant flew at me in a rage and went directly for my throat. It wasn't satisfied with a finger. No, sir, it lunged straight at my jugular vein. I was only able to get away from it by grabbing a piece of cardboard to beat it back until I could reach the edge of the dumpster and jump out. Even then it kept hissing and chattering at me. I'm positive if it had been able to leap over the side, it would have come after me and taken a chunk out of my leg just to teach me a lesson. Ever since almost losing my jugular vein, I've paid careful attention to dumpster rats until I know whether or not they're the mafia kind. So when I heard the hissing sound in Wong's dumpster, I pulled my hand back from the other 2 slices of pizza and searched for the rat. I spied it sitting just behind the pizza box, trying to hide between 2 large bags of trash. Its whiskers were twitching like it wanted a showdown, but for the moment it just sat there observing me, like I was observing it. That's when I heard the sound of squeaking hinges and glanced up. The back door of Wong's Walk was opening. My leg muscles twitched faster than rat whiskers, and I jumped over the edge of the dumpster, hit the ground, and took off running. Man, I really wanted those other 2 pieces of pizza, but I wasn't about to stay around and get my leg chewed by a mafia rat thug or have my life threatened by a human thug with a neck the size of a light pole. "Wait!" I heard a male voice yelling behind me. "Don't eat that! I'll get you a meal from the restaurant." I kept running. Nobody's ever offered me free food. I've heard about people who do that, though. They offer stuff to eat as bait to lure kids into a trap. They're traffickers, and they're the absolute worst kind of thugs. I rounded the corner of the alleyway. Turning right toward Baker Street, I ran to the intersection, took another right turn, and glanced back. I didn't see any large muscle men looking like they wanted to hurt me, so I slowed to a walk. Finding a place in an alcove to sit down, I wiped off some coffee grounds from my pizza slice, at least I think that's what they were, and stuffed my face. It was pretty good. My stomach didn't even thank me because it was still complaining. All right, I answered it. I'll wait for an hour and circle back to grab the other 2 slices. Does that make you happy?" This time I got no reply, but I think it was satisfied. I waited for a while and then headed back toward Wong's Walk. But I'm not brainless, so before entering the alleyway, I edged up to the corner of the building next to it and scanned the area to make sure no one was around. Everything was quiet. I slowly advanced toward the dumpster, ready to run the second I heard hinges squeaking. I looked in at the rest of my pizza. That no-good mafia rat had eaten all the cheese and pepperoni off of one of the slices. The other slice was untouched. Pulling myself up and over the edge of the dumpster, I watched for any varmint thugs and glanced at the back door of the restaurant to make sure it was still closed. That was when I noticed 2 plastic food containers on the steps in front of the door, the kind Chinese restaurants use for takeout orders. I've seen dozens of them in dumpsters, sometimes with edible food inside. I grabbed the pizza slice that still had toppings on it, jumped over the edge of the dumpster to snatch the food containers, and took off jogging toward the entrance of the alley. 5 minutes later, I was back in my alcove, chowing down on a real, never-been-on-the-inside of a dumpster meal of chicken and broccoli and fried rice, and it was still warm. I groaned with pleasure as the flavor saturated my taste buds and then slowly moved on toward my stomach, which by now was humming in absolute wonder. When I finished my real meal, I grabbed the pizza slice and ate it, too. I should have eaten it first, but I'd been so overcome by the thought of genuine food that my brain short-circuited. I remembered the note that was taped to the top of one of the lids. I pulled it off and opened it. It said, "There will be another meal waiting for you tomorrow at the same time." My brain came back online real fast, and even though my stomach began celebrating, I calmed it right down. No way. If you think I'm going to go back there and get nabbed by a trafficker, or whoever that guy is, think again. I'm not taking his bait. The next morning, I went on my usual rounds visiting my usual dumpsters. While I was searching through the one behind the Main Eats restaurant on Main Street, I heard a noise nearby. "Hey! You get out of there!" A woman had come out of the restaurant's back door and was running toward the dumpster, angrily waving a broom in her hand. "You kids, leave this dumpster alone!" I jumped out and landed on the pavement. My plan was to take off running, but by that time the lady was right beside me. She whacked me hard on the head with the end of the broom. I ran to get away from her, but she followed me, and she wasn't letting up with that broom. "We don't need your kind making our business look bad. Go on, get out, and if I ever see you again, I'll call the cops." It wasn't until I ran out in front of the restaurant that she stopped coming after me, and I knew I was safe. She turned back and headed toward the restaurant entrance, shaking her head and muttering to herself something about filthy rabble spoiling the reputation of her restaurant. I reached up and felt my head where she'd hit me with the broom handle. There was a small lump forming to remind me to cross off the main eats as a regular dumpster stop. That left only 6 dumpsters on my daily route. Things weren't looking too good. I thought of Wong's Walk and the food that guy had promised me, but I quickly put it out of my mind and headed toward my other dumpsters. Within an hour, I'd visited all of them. The only edible food I'd found was a measly piece of slightly soggy peanut butter bread. That was it. My stomach started to remind me of the deliciousness of yesterday's Chinese food. But since food workers were now at the top of my dangerous species list, right alongside evil mafia rats, I told my stomach to be quiet. Yet no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about warm chicken and broccoli with fried rice. Soon my taste buds joined forces with my stomach and begged me to go back to Wong's. Finally, I gave in. Okay, I'll go and check it out, but no promises. Before I entered Wong's back alley, I stopped again and peered around the corner. I didn't see anyone. Walking on tiptoes to be as quiet as possible, I looked for food containers in front of the restaurant's back door. The steps were empty. I knew it. You can't trust food workers. I even looked inside the dumpster in hopes that the guy might have put the containers in there. Are you looking for these? They're here, like I promised. Following the sound of the male voice, I turned back toward the alley's street entrance. The food worker I'd seen yesterday was standing there holding a plastic bag with plastic food containers inside. Even though I knew the alley was a dead end, I instinctively searched behind me for an escape route. I was trapped. I think you'll like today's meal. It's called egg foo young, and in my opinion, our sauce is the best. My brain was short-circuiting again. This guy wasn't stocky like the food worker at Al's Pizzeria, but I was pretty skinny, and I didn't think I could take him in a fight. He just stood there waiting for me to come and get the bag. I didn't know what to do. I looked him over more carefully. He was tall and fit and had tanned skin, round dark eyes, and dark brown hair. His face wasn't all scrunched up with anger like the broom lady's face, but that didn't mean anything. He was probably a trafficker. Come on, he said. I'm not going to hurt you. I just don't want you to have to eat dumpster food. I had to face him. There was no other way out of the alley. I took a couple of steps in his direction, trying to work out how I could get by him. Maybe if I pretended to move to his left and then dash to his right, he would lunge for me in the wrong direction and I'd be able to get away. I said, I'm not going to hurt you. I have no ulterior motives, I promise. I had no idea what ulterior meant, but I knew what motives were, and I didn't trust his one bit. I inched forward to within 6 feet of him. He was still holding the bag and smiling like he knew something I didn't. Here, take it, and tomorrow I'll have more for you. Now I was sure he was baiting me. Eventually, I had to make my move. I took a couple of steps toward him, looked to my left to throw him off, and then dashed right, running as close as I could to the brick wall of the building on my right so I could avoid his attack. But it never came. Instead, the guy backed away to give me space. I got by him and started to take off toward Baker Street. He called after me, I'll leave it here on the sidewalk for you, and I'll see you tomorrow. I stopped far enough away from him and turned around to see him setting the bag down on the sidewalk at the entrance of the alleyway, and then he went inside the restaurant. My stomach started talking to me again. Shut up, I said. Let me think. I absent-mindedly rubbed the lump on my head and winced. It was a painful reminder that food workers can't be trusted. But But the man was nowhere in sight, and I knew I could probably grab the food and get away before he came outside again. I sprinted to snag the plastic bag and then took off for my alcove. I went back the next day. The egg foo young had been unbelievable. The combination of eggs, vegetables, and chicken inside of a fried coating with a sauce that, like the man said, was the best. Well, it was enough for my stomach to coerce me until I caved. I have to admit, though, this time I agreed with my stomach. I figured I was smart enough to keep from being trafficked, and if the guy was willing to put the food down on the sidewalk, I was fast enough to snatch it and run. The next day, and for the whole next week, I only had to stand at the entrance of the alley, and after a couple of minutes, Mr. Food Worker would come out with my meal in a bag. We settled into a routine that worked. He came out and held the bag out to me. I stood my ground a good 10 feet away and waited. He set the bag down and went inside. I waited and then grabbed it and ran. There was always a note attached to the top container promising another meal tomorrow and telling me the name of the meal. My taste buds were getting a tour of China. I had Kung Pao chicken, sweet and sour pork, Peking roast duck, and other dishes with even funnier names. Some of the ingredients were weird, like the dish that had tiny corn cobs in it, but I didn't care because it all tasted great. I could feel my skinny bones getting some flesh on them, and my stomach was as happy as it had been for a long time. I even caught myself whistling as I turned the corner at Baker Street and walked the 100 yards between there and Wong's restaurant. Standing at the far side of the alley entrance, I waited as usual for Mr. Food Worker to come out with my meal. I noticed a small cafe table and 2 chairs sitting on the sidewalk under Wong's restaurant window. They were new. All at once, a hand gripped me hard around my arm and a sharp jab pushed against the middle of my back. A man's voice behind me threatened quietly, "I've got a knife at your back, so don't try to get away. Come with me now, or you'll feel more than just the prick of my knife blade." I could feel his hot breath on my head and neck. He pulled me around and kept me close to him as we walked toward Baker Street. That's when I saw the open door of a car parked along the curb and realized he was taking me toward it. With all my strength, I jerked to my left to pull away from him, but the pressure of his steel grip only increased. He yanked me closer to his body, and I felt a sharp pain in my back. I couldn't fight his force or his knife. We were only about 10 feet from the open car door when I heard the voice of Mr. Food Worker yelling behind me, "You let my son go! Get your hands off him!" My captor's solid grip slackened momentarily, enough for me to wrench my arm loose and break away. As I ran back toward Wong's walk, away from the open car door, Mr. Food Worker passed by within inches of me, moving fast in the direction of the car. His face was burning hot with anger. But before he got there, the other man was able to jump into the car, slam the car door shut, and race away. The crazy driver pulled dangerously into traffic, careened through the green light at Baker Street, and took off down the hill. Mr. Food Worker turned around and headed in my direction. The hot anger had lessened, but it was still there in his eyes. "I need something to write on," he said urgently. While he searched his pockets, I backed up to move away from him and stumbled into one of the cafe chairs. He pulled out a pen and a scrap of paper and scribbled something down before straightening up and looking at me. The fire in his face had turned into a look of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. We were only a few feet apart from each other. I had my hand on my back where the knife point had been. Even though I could feel a wet trickle down my back, I pulled it away and nodded. "Let me get something for that." He was looking at where my hand had been. "And I'll bring your food. Just wait a minute." As he moved toward the restaurant entrance, I backed away to a safe distance. My body was shaking from head to toe. My brain began to wonder about Mr. Food Worker and what had just happened. Maybe he was a trafficker, and he'd been defending me like I was his territory, like he owned me. I mean, he told the thug I was his son. Nobody does that unless they think you belong to them. Maybe he wasn't a trafficker, but if he wasn't, why did he defend me? And why all the free meals? I couldn't think of any other motive than wanting to use me. He came out of the restaurant carrying 2 plates full of food. Setting them down on the table, he pulled a bandage and a tube of ointment out of his pocket and held them out toward me. I didn't move. "What's ulterior mean?" I asked. "What?" His eyebrows pinched together like he wasn't following me. "What does ulterior mean?" I said again. He tossed the bandage and the ointment onto the table and rubbed his forehead with one hand. It means intentionally hidden. You said that day in the alley you had no ulterior motives. How do I know you're not a trafficker?" Mr. Food Worker stared into the air, his eyebrows still pinching together like his brain was trying to catch up with me. Then he started to slowly nod as his eyebrows relaxed and his eyes got softer, and the smile I was used to seeing came back. "So you think all this food is because I'm trying to reel you into a trafficking ring?" He looked genuinely clued in now. I wasn't sure of anything anymore, so I just said, "Maybe." He nodded again. "Well, I can see how you would think that. After all, that's what some traffickers do. They bait you until you trust them, and that's how they hook you." Then he looked at me. "You're smart to be wary about that." I was glad to hear him say that, until I wondered how he knew that information about traffickers. "But what about my defending you from that thug?" he asked. "Doesn't that say something about me?" I didn't know if I should tell him what I was thinking, but I figured we were on a roll, so I did. "You could have been defending me as your territory. You called me your son." His eyebrows definitely went up on that one, like he was genuinely surprised. "I said you were my son because if they were traffickers, they would leave you alone. They're not going to go after someone with a family as easily as they'll go after a street kid with no home." I stared at him, my brain bouncing back and forth between ulterior motives and no ulterior motives, and wondering if there were real food workers in the world who don't want to punch your lights out, and questioning how he knew those facts about traffickers. He just shrugged and said, "I own this restaurant, and no, I'm not Asian, but that doesn't make me a trafficker. My wife is Asian, and this is our restaurant. Her family's name is Wong." He pointed at the food on the table. "And our food is getting cold. Shall we sit down and eat?" I backed away a few feet. He saw my hesitation and said, "That's why I brought a small table out here. It's in plain sight of people on the sidewalk and the public eye, and it allows you to leave any time you want to. I promise I have no ulterior motives." At least I knew what he was talking about now, but that didn't make it true. He sat down in one of the chairs, closed his eyes for a second, and breathed a deep sigh before digging into his food. My stomach, well, you can guess what it was saying. It was telling me to get on with it and start feeding it real food. I looked around behind me. There were lots of other shops open on the street. If I needed to, I could run in the opposite direction past all those shops, and he probably wouldn't chase me because it would be too obvious. I pulled out the empty chair. He put the other plate of food in front of it on the table. I sat down. I hadn't eaten a meal with anyone else for a while. It felt strange. Grabbing the fork, which was real, like the meal, I started shoving food into my mouth. It was spaghetti of some type, but with a different kind of brown sauce. Neither of us spoke. The food was so tasty, I just wanted to eat. And besides, I didn't know what to say. He was the next one to talk. This dish is called lo mein. You could say it's the Chinese version of Italian spaghetti. I nodded while slurping a bunch of noodles into my mouth. When I'd swallowed them, I thought I should say something. Thanks for rescuing me from that thug. As I spoke the words, it hit me hard in the gut that I could have been trafficked, but this guy had saved me from it. I looked at his eyes. The angry fire was completely gone, and they were soft now, and real. "Why'd you do that?" I asked. The feeling in my gut had risen into my throat. I tried to push it down. "Any good person will do their best to help another person in distress," he said. I fought the tightness in my throat so it wouldn't reach my eyes and do something crazy, like cry. I thought a change of subject might help. "Why are you giving me all this food?" The man's face got as soft as his eyes, and that smile of his showed up again. He paused his fork in midair before taking another bite and said, "A wise man once said to do good to all people, and since he and I are friends, I try to live by that." He put his fork down on his plate. "How's your back?" I'd forgotten all about that because the wet trickle wasn't happening anymore. "It's good," I said, and took another bite. "You might want to use that cream on the wound to prevent infection." He was pointing at the little tube of ointment. I put it into the pocket of my pants for later. I was becoming convinced he wasn't a trafficker. "You really own this place?" I pointed toward Wong's. "Yep, 2 years now. It's a lot of work, but there are some great perks." He picked up his fork to eat the last few bites of his lo mein. I noticed that instead of slurping 5 or 6 inches of noodles at a time into his mouth, he was twisting the noodles around his fork and eating them that way. It looked a whole lot less messy than my slurping technique. I tried his idea, but soon had a whole glob of noodles in my mouth. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him grinning. "That was great," he said. "Maybe try wrapping fewer noodles around the fork the next time." I grinned back. If he owned a Chinese restaurant, I figured he knew what he was talking about. He looked at me and said, "My name is Manny." I chewed and swallowed and said nothing. My legs started to twitch in case I had to escape. He shrugged and said, "I'm just introducing myself. You don't have to tell me your name." My legs calmed down. We both finished our food at the same time. He gathered the plates into a pile and picked up the napkins. That reminded me, "What did you write on that piece of paper?" I could see by the look in his eyes he was tracking with me this time. "I got the license plate number of the car. I'm going to report it to the police." He raised his hand like he knew that would upset me, which it did, and said, "Don't worry, I'll keep you anonymous. I'll give them the license plate number of the car and tell them that I saw a man who was trying to pick up a street kid who fought him and got away." He looked right at me. "But you understand they need to be reported or they'll continue to do what they do, right?" Manny seemed to get me. I wanted nothing to do with the cops, and he knew that. But he also had a point. Those thugs would continue to do what they do if they weren't stopped. I looked into his eyes, which were still watching me, and said, "You got a point." He stood up and smiled. "Same time tomorrow?" I smiled back and said, "Thanks." "Great. See you then." Manny walked into the restaurant with his dirty dishes. As I started walking back toward Baker Street, I heard the restaurant door open again. I turned around quick to see if he was coming after me in a surprise move from behind, like the thug had come after me from behind. But only his head was poking out of the door, looking at me inquisitively. "I forgot," he called out. "Do you want some almond cookies or fried bananas for dessert? And do you want some hot jasmine tea? I can send them with you for later." That feeling in my gut rushed to my throat again and pushed toward my eyes. I nodded. "I'll be right back," he said, and disappeared inside. A minute later, he came out with the cookies in a paper bag, a second container of fried bananas sprinkled with powdered sugar, and tea in a paper cup. He stopped a few feet away and held them out, like he knew I wouldn't want him to walk up to me, at least not yet. He really seemed to get me. I took the bag and the container and the tea. I'd never had jasmine tea, but I figured everything else from his restaurant had been good, so it was probably okay. "See you tomorrow," he said, and headed back toward the restaurant entrance. Before he went inside, I called back to him, "Jesus." He looked at me like he wasn't following me again. "My name is Jesus," I said. He just smiled that same old smile and said, "That's the name of my wise friend." He waved and went inside. I started to get suspicious about his friend and I having the same name, but then I figured a lot of people are named Jesus, so it was probably just a coincidence. As I took off toward Baker Street, that good feeling in my gut leaked to the outside and turned into a smile. I started to whistle again, because tomorrow I had the promise of real food, at a real table, with a real person. To celebrate, I decided to take the rest of the day off from dumpster diving and sit on a park bench to eat my Chinese desserts and drink my Chinese tea, and think about all that's real. Thank you so much for listening. I trust you enjoyed the story. Of course, I'm always interested in what you have to say about it, so please leave a comment below. And join me next week when I share about today's story, where the idea came from, how it applies to life, and how it builds hope, etc. Also, in the description below, you will find a link to the written form of today's story, as well as information about my allegorical novel and other books I've written. And finally, as you can imagine, it does take time to write, edit, and record these stories. If you enjoy them, please consider supporting their creation with a one-time thanks. I will see you next week, and until then, I hope you have a great week.